Imagine risking everything to save a life, only to come face to face with the man who ruined yours. This is the story of David Miller, a homeless hero who becomes a symbol of truth and justice after a daring rescue from a burning building. When the world discovers the hidden connection between him and a powerful businessman, a battle for accountability unfolds. Watch until the end to see how one man's courage sparks a fight for redemption. If you're moved by stories of resilience and justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. The night was pierced by the wailing of sirens, red and blue lights flashing against the backdrop of the luxury high-rise engulfed in flames. Chaos reigned as residents and passers-by gathered, watching in horror as fire crews fought to contain the inferno. The thick, black smoke billowed from the windows, casting a grim shadow over the scene, while desperate voices echoed through the air. Among the crowd, unnoticed, stood a man dressed in ragged, soot-streaked clothes. His name was David Miller, a figure often invisible to society, just another homeless man who blended into the background of the city. His eyes, however, were wide open, scanning the building intently, the flames reflecting off his dark, tired eyes. He could hear the cries from the upper floors, and for a moment, his heart clenched with a mix of fear and urgency. It was then he noticed the small face peering through a window on one of the higher floors, mouth open in silent screams. A child was trapped, and the firefighters were still struggling to reach that part of the building. Panic swelled around him, but David felt something different: determination. He pushed through the crowd, moving closer to the barricades, while the officers tried to keep people at a distance. As he approached, he heard bits of frantic conversation among the firefighters. "There's no way to get there," one of them said, sweat and soot smearing his brow. "We need to keep the fire from spreading." But the kid, David's mind raced. Years ago, he had worked as a maintenance technician for an old building downtown, and though this one was far more modern, he could still recognize the network of fire escapes and emergency ladders. He knew there had to be another way in, a way that wasn't blocked by the flames. Before anyone could stop him, he slipped past the barriers, disappearing into the smoky entrance. Inside, the heat was suffocating, and the air burned his lungs with every breath. Flames licked at the walls, and smoke curled around the corridors like a living thing, searching for any gap to escape. David had to move quickly, his mind focused solely on finding a path to the child. He navigated through the hallways, his knowledge of old maintenance systems guiding him to emergency exits that others might not think to check. Through the haze, he finally spotted the stairwell leading to the upper floors. He could hear the child's cries growing louder as he climbed, and it pushed him forward, ignoring the searing pain in his chest. This was not the first time he had rushed into danger, but it was the first time he had done so with nothing to lose. He reached the apartment where the child was trapped, the door barely hanging on its hinges. Inside, the room was thick with smoke, but David could make out the outline of a little girl, clutching a stuffed toy, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked at him wide-eyed, not understanding why a stranger, dirty and disheveled, had come to save her. "It's okay," David said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm here to get you out." He scooped the child into his arms, shielding her face from the smoke as he retraced his steps, the flames closing in around them. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he pushed on, driven by the sheer will to see her safe. By the time they emerged outside, the fire had spread, and the firefighters had shifted focus, still unaware of his presence until they saw him staggering out of the smoky entrance, the child clinging to his neck. There was a collective gasp from the onlookers, followed by a cheer. Cameras flashed, and within moments, the scene was recorded and shared across social media. But for David, there was no sense of relief. He gently handed the child over to the medics, his hands shaking as he backed away, unnoticed by the reporters swarming to cover the story. He could have left then, melted back into the anonymity of the streets, but something stopped him. As the media crowded around the little girl, David saw a figure pushing through them. A man in an expensive suit, his face pale with worry. It was the child's father, and in an instant, David's eyes narrowed as he recognized him. James Cole, the powerful businessman who once owned the company where David worked, the man who had ruined his life with a few strokes of a pen, stood there, now clutching his daughter in relief. And as James glanced around, trying to find the person who had saved his child, his gaze briefly met David's. There was a flicker of recognition, but it was quickly overshadowed by confusion and then indifference, as if he couldn't quite place the face of the man who had risked everything to save his daughter. David's heart pounded as he waited for a word, a nod, any acknowledgement. But James turned away, his focus shifting to the reporters, leaving David standing there, invisible once more. The aftermath of the rescue was a whirlwind. News channels had picked up the story, and within hours, clips of David emerging from the smoke with the child in his arms were circulating online. Words like hero, bravery, and selfless act were plastered across social media, and the video was replayed countless times, gaining traction on every platform. The world wanted to know who this mysterious savior was, but nobody had a name to match the face covered in soot. Meanwhile, David lingered at the edges of the scene, watching as ambulances and fire trucks lined the street. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching it all unfold from a distance. The truth was, he didn't want the attention. What he wanted was something much deeper, something that no headline could grant him, recognition from the one person who had wronged him. David's eyes followed James Cole as he maneuvered through the crowd, accepting condolences and nods of relief from concerned onlookers. The little girl, now safely wrapped in a blanket, clung to her father, and the sight sent a pang through David's chest. He remembered the days when he, too, had walked those city streets with purpose, before his life had unraveled. But as James stepped in front of a camera, ready to give a statement, David's mind flashed back to years ago. The bustling office where he used to work, the day he had been called into a meeting room and coldly informed that his department was being downsized. He had pleaded, explaining that he needed the job to support his family, but James had barely looked up from his desk, dismissing him with a curt, "It's just business." That decision had set off a chain reaction that led to David losing his home, his dignity, and, eventually, his place in society. And now, here they were, the man who had thrown him out and the man he had saved. David clenched his fists, the anger mixing with a sense of bitter irony. Even now, James was in control, addressing the media with the polished ease of a businessman, carefully choosing his words. "I want to express my deepest gratitude to the brave individual who saved my daughter," James said, his voice steady, but without a trace of sincerity. "Whoever you are, if you're out there, please know that our family owes you everything." David felt the words cut through him, hollow and patronizing. James's eyes scanned the crowd as if trying to spot the hero, but there was no real effort behind it. It was all a performance, a spectacle to maintain his public image. The gratitude was just another carefully managed piece of PR. And then, a moment of truth. A reporter, more curious than the others, turned to the fire chief standing nearby. "Do we have any information about the man who brought the child out?" she asked. The chief hesitated, looking around until he caught sight of David, still hovering near the edge of the scene. The reporter's eyes lit up as she approached him. "Sir, are you the one who saved that little girl?" she asked, microphone already raised, ready to capture his answer. David felt a wave of unease, realizing that this was his chance to step forward, to tell his side of the story. But as the microphone drew closer, he caught sight of James watching him, a flicker of recognition finally crossing his features. James's expression shifted, his mouth tightening. David could almost see the wheels turning in his mind, calculating the risk of letting the story get out of hand. If the media learned that the hero was a homeless man, someone whom James himself had discarded, the narrative would shift dramatically. David wasn't just a random Good Samaritan. He was a direct reminder of James's own past actions, actions that could now come back to haunt him. "Please, sir, can you tell us your name?" the reporter pressed, the crowd now starting to pay more attention. David opened his mouth, but before he could speak, James stepped forward, cutting off the moment. "I would appreciate it if we could give this gentleman some privacy," he said, raising his hands to calm the situation. "The most important thing is that my daughter is safe, thanks to his bravery. We'll make sure to find him and thank him properly." The reporter, slightly taken aback, lowered the microphone, and David felt the opportunity slip away. Once again, James had managed to control the narrative, diverting attention and making it clear that no one should dig too deeply. It was a subtle but effective move, one that left David standing there, overshadowed by the very man who had ruined his life. As the crowd began to disperse, David felt a mix of rage and helplessness. James had acknowledged his actions, but only in a way that allowed him to maintain the upper hand. It was as if David was being erased all over again, his story denied a voice, just like when he was pushed out of his job. The injustice was palpable, but for now, there was nothing he could do but watch. The days following the rescue were a blur for David. Clips of him carrying the child out of the burning building spread like wildfire across social media, turning him into an overnight sensation. However, his identity remained a mystery, as James's subtle intervention had kept reporters from digging too deeply. People praised the unknown hero online, but there was no face to go with the story, just the image of a man covered in soot, eyes tired but determined. Meanwhile, James Cole capitalized on the media attention. He appeared on talk shows and interviews, recounting the harrowing night and how his daughter had been saved. "We are still looking for the brave man who risked his life," he would say, his tone rehearsed, "and we will do everything we can to find him and thank him properly." The public bought into his narrative, praising him for his concern and generosity, not knowing that his words were empty. Behind the scenes, James was making sure no one got too close to discovering David's identity. David, on the other hand, had no control over the narrative. Each time he saw James on TV, speaking about the heroic savior, it felt like another slap in the face. The world was talking about him, but no one knew who he was, and worse, no one knew who James truly was. Despite the acclaim, David was still just a man without a home, wandering the streets, eating at soup kitchens, and sleeping in shelters. One evening, while watching a segment about the rescue at a small diner, David noticed something that made his blood boil. James was seated on a polished leather chair in a studio, giving yet another interview. The host leaned forward, their tone eager. "Mr. Cole, it's incredible how this man appeared out of nowhere to save your daughter. Have you thought about what you would say to him if he was watching right now?" James paused, a well-practiced look of solemn gratitude crossing his face. "I would tell him that his actions have restored my faith in humanity. We live in a world where so much divides us, but what he did is a reminder that courage and kindness can bring us all together. He's a symbol of hope, and I would welcome him into my home as a friend." David felt his hands clench around the edge of the table. A friend, he thought bitterly. The hypocrisy was almost unbearable. James was acting like a saint, while David knew firsthand the man's ruthless side. And then, a thought crept into his mind. What if James was using this to elevate his status, to make himself look better to investors, clients, and the public? The very idea that James would profit off David's actions made him sick. As he left the diner, David's thoughts spiraled. He had never asked for recognition, but he was tired of being silenced, tired of watching as James controlled the narrative once again. For years, he had been powerless, forced to endure the consequences of decisions made by people like James. But now, he had a chance to make his voice heard, even if it meant exposing the past he'd tried so hard to escape. Over the next few days, David wandered the city, trying to figure out his next move. He knew that stepping forward could be risky. If the public learned about his history, about how James's company had laid off countless workers in a brutal cost-cutting measure, it could backfire. People might see him as bitter or vindictive, trying to tarnish James's reputation. But it was more than that. David wanted the truth to come out not just for himself, but for everyone else who had been treated unjustly. As he mulled over his options, a chance encounter changed everything. David was sitting on a bench near a park when he was approached by a young journalist named Emily Sanchez. She had seen the video clips of the rescue and had been trying to dig deeper, frustrated by how difficult it had been to get any information about the man who had saved the child. Unlike the others, She wasn't deterred by James's interference. "Excuse me," she said, hesitating before sitting down next to him. "I don't want to bother you, but I've been looking for the man who saved that little girl in the fire, and I think you might be him." David tensed, unsure of what to say. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, hoping she would just leave him alone. But Emily was persistent. "Look, I've seen the footage. I've been to the area where it happened, and I asked around. People said they saw a man who fits your description, and you were there that night. Please, if you are him, just let me tell your story. I promise I won't twist it or use it for clicks. I just want the truth." David hesitated, glancing at her earnest expression. For the first time, someone was asking him not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to know. He saw a sincerity in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time, and slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "but there's more to it than just that night." Over the next hour, David shared everything. How he had worked for James's company, how he had been dismissed without warning, and how that decision had led to the downward spiral that left him on the streets. He spoke about the night of the fire, his struggle to save the child, and how James had tried to silence him even then. Emily listened intently, scribbling notes and asking questions, making sure she got every detail right. "I'm going to write this story," she said when he finished, "and I'm going to make sure people see it. They need to know what happened, not just to you, but to all the people James has hurt." David wasn't sure if he should feel relieved or anxious. He had opened up, but now there was no turning back. As Emily left, promising to get in touch soon, he wondered if he had done the right thing. If the story went public, it could finally expose James for who he truly was, but it could also mean reopening old wounds and facing the world's judgment. The article hit the web 2 days later, and it was everything David had hoped for and feared. Emily had kept her word, writing a piece that was raw, honest, and unflinching. She detailed David's heroic actions during the fire, but she also delved into his past, revealing the darker side of James Cole's business practices. The story described how James's company had ruthlessly cut staff during a financial crisis, laying off hundreds, including David, who had been left without a safety net. From corporate success to homeless hero, the untold story of David Miller, the headline read, accompanied by a photograph of David, his eyes weary but resolute, taken by Emily on the day they met. The story painted a stark contrast between James's polished public persona and the reality of his actions. It was a narrative that resonated deeply with readers, especially in an age where discussions about corporate greed and inequality were becoming more prevalent. Within hours, the article was trending, shared across social media platforms, and picked up by several other news outlets. Comments poured in, expressing admiration for David's courage and outrage at the way he had been treated. For the first time in years, David felt a sense of vindication. People knew the truth and they were on his side. It seemed like things were finally turning in his favor. But just as quickly as the story gained traction, the backlash began. James Cole was not a man who would sit quietly and let his image be tarnished. The day after the article was published, he held a press conference, flanked by lawyers and PR representatives. The cameras clicked incessantly as he took to the podium, a look of grave concern on his face. "I want to address the recent story circulating about our company and myself," he began, his voice calm and measured. "First and foremost, I want to say that I am deeply grateful to the man who saved my daughter. His actions were nothing short of heroic, and I have been actively trying to find him so I can express my gratitude." He paused, letting the statement sink in before continuing. "However, I must also address the allegations made against me and my company. During a difficult financial period, we had to make some very hard decisions. It was never my intention to cause harm, and I deeply regret if any of our former employees felt they were treated unfairly. But the truth is, those decisions were necessary to save the business and protect the jobs of those who remained." The narrative was slick, carefully crafted to shift the blame away from himself. He portrayed himself as a reluctant victim of circumstance, a leader forced to make difficult decisions for the greater good. And then he went a step further, offering what appeared to be an olive branch. "I want to make amends. I am setting up a fund to help those who have struggled due to job loss, including Mr. Miller. I hope this gesture will be seen as a step toward healing and reconciliation. David watched the press conference from a small TV in a shelter, his stomach churning. It was all wrong. James had twisted the situation, turning his own misdeeds into an opportunity to look magnanimous. Worse, the fund was just another way for James to control the narrative, to buy forgiveness without ever having to admit any wrongdoing. The public response was mixed. Some people praised James for taking responsibility, while others saw through the facade, but the overall effect was enough to muddy the waters. Emily contacted David that evening, her voice tinged with frustration. "I'm sorry, David. I didn't think he'd try to spin it like this," she said. "But we can't stop now. People are still talking, and there's a way to keep this story alive." David felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, unsure if he had the strength to keep fighting this battle. "We need to make sure your voice is heard," Emily said. "James is trying to sweep this under the rug with money, but people will listen if you speak out. You need to tell your story publicly. I can arrange an interview, one where you can say everything you need to say without interruption." David hesitated. The thought of standing in front of cameras, of putting himself out there for the world to see, terrified him. For so long, he had been invisible, hiding in the shadows, and now he was being asked to step into the spotlight. But he also knew that if he didn't, James would win. The truth would be buried under layers of PR and legal jargon, and David would be forgotten once more. Reluctantly, he agreed. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." The next day, Emily arranged for a live interview on a popular news channel. As the time approached, David sat in the green room, his hands trembling. He could hear the muffled sounds of the studio audience and the hum of the equipment, and it made his head spin. When the producer came to escort him to the set, he felt like he was walking to the edge of a cliff, with no idea if he would fly or fall. The host introduced him as the man who had saved a child from a burning building, and for a moment, the studio was filled with applause. But David wasn't here to talk about the rescue. He was here to tell his story, the whole story. When the host asked him to describe what had happened that night, he gave a brief, straightforward account, and then he began to speak about his past. He talked about his job at James's company, about how he had been let go without warning, and how that decision had unraveled his entire life. "I'm not looking for sympathy," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I'm not trying to make excuses for what happened to me, but people need to understand that actions have consequences. When you make a decision that affects someone's life, you have to take responsibility for it. James Cole might think he can throw money at this problem and make it go away, but that doesn't change what he did." The interview was raw, unfiltered, and emotional. David spoke not just for himself, but for everyone who had been affected by James's decisions. By the end, there was no doubt about who was telling the truth. But as he left the studio, David knew that this was only the beginning. James would fight back harder now, and the battle was far from over. The interview had a ripple effect. People who had been on the fence now found themselves swayed by David's raw honesty. He was no longer just a faceless figure on a viral video. He was a person with a story, one that resonated with anyone who had ever felt powerless against a system that prioritized profit over people. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting David, and the public began to demand accountability from James Cole, questioning his leadership and ethics. But James was not the type to back down easily. As soon as the interview aired, his legal team sprang into action. They attempted to discredit David, insinuating that his claims were exaggerated and that he was simply trying to tarnish the reputation of a respected businessman. They dug into David's past, looking for anything that could be used against him. Within a day, articles began to surface questioning David's reliability, focusing on his homelessness as if it were a moral failing rather than a consequence of the hardships he had endured. Emily was furious. "This is classic damage control," she said, pacing around her office as she spoke to David on the phone. "They're trying to make you look like the problem, instead of facing the fact that their actions led to this." David could hear the frustration in her voice, but he felt it 10 times more acutely. Once again, James was trying to control the story, but this time, David was determined not to let him. "I'm done hiding," David said, his voice firm. "If he wants to play dirty, fine. But I'm going to fight back." The next day, David called for a press conference. It was a bold move, one that surprised everyone, including James. The media, now captivated by this unfolding drama, eagerly gathered to hear what David had to say. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and microphones, all aimed at a small stage where David stood, looking resolute despite the pressure bearing down on him. As he stepped up to the podium, the room went silent. "I want to thank everyone for coming," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't ask for any of this attention. I never wanted to be in the spotlight, but I can't stay silent anymore. There are people out there who are trying to make this about me, trying to twist my words, but this isn't just my story. This is about every person who was treated as disposable, who was cast aside without a second thought. I'm standing here today because I refuse to be invisible any longer." David's words hit hard, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Then, without warning, he pulled out a document from his jacket and held it up for the cameras to see. "This is my severance letter," he said, "signed by James Cole, and I'm not the only one who has one of these. There are hundreds of people who were laid off just like me, many of whom have stories worse than mine. And I know because they've been reaching out to me ever since my story was published." He paused, letting the weight of his statement sink in. "I'm not here to attack James Cole personally. I'm here to demand accountability. I want him to acknowledge what he did not just to me, but to all the people whose lives were upended by his decisions. And I'm willing to face him directly, publicly, if that's what it takes." The press conference was electric, and within minutes, the news channels were broadcasting David's challenge live. James, who had been watching from his office, felt his control over the situation slipping away. His PR team scrambled to figure out a response, but before they could even draft a statement, James made a decision. He wasn't going to let David paint him as the villain. He would confront him directly. The following day, James announced that he would be hosting his own press conference and that David was welcome to join him. The media framed it as a showdown, a confrontation between the man in power and the man he had wronged. The tension was palpable as people speculated on what would happen when they finally faced each other. On the day of the event, the venue was packed, with news vans lining the streets and cameras pointed at the stage, ready to capture every moment. James arrived first, dressed impeccably, his demeanor calm but stern. He took his place at the podium, the room silent as he began to speak. "I have heard Mr. Miller's claims, and I believe it is important to address them directly," he said, his voice measured. "I understand that there were decisions made in the past that affected people's lives, and I take full responsibility for those decisions. But I want to make one thing clear. I have never and will never intentionally cause harm to anyone." The statement was carefully crafted, but David could see through it. James was trying to appear empathetic without actually admitting any wrongdoing. But then James took a step further, something no one had anticipated. "And because I believe in transparency and fairness, I have invited Mr. Miller to join me here today, so we can discuss this openly, without hiding behind lawyers or PR statements." James gestured to a side entrance, and all eyes turned as David stepped out, walking across the stage until he stood just a few feet from James. The two men faced each other, and for a moment, there was silence, heavy and tense. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion on their faces. David felt his heart pounding, but he forced himself to speak. "I don't need your sympathy, James," he said, his voice clear. "I need you to tell the truth. Admit what you did not just to me, but to everyone. Stop hiding behind your money and your excuses." James's eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation crossing his features. "And what would that accomplish, David? What do you want from me? An apology? Compensation? What would make this right?" David's response was immediate, and it stunned the audience. "I don't want your money. I want you to apologize publicly to every single person you wronged. Not just to me, but to all those families you put in the same position. Admit that you chose profit over people, and promise to change the way you do business." The room was silent, the tension almost suffocating. James hesitated, his composure cracking for the first time. He hadn't expected this, and it showed. He had thought he could outmaneuver David, but now he was faced with a demand he couldn't easily dismiss or spin. "I will consider it," James stammered, but the words felt hollow, and the room knew it. The reporters could sense the shift, and they began to press harder, asking questions that James struggled to answer. For the first time, he wasn't in control, and the cracks in his polished facade were showing. David stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "Consider it? That's not good enough. You owe it to them, to us, to do what's right. Or are you too proud to admit when you've made a mistake?" The confrontation was raw, and the audience could feel the weight of it. This wasn't just a battle between two men. It was a fight for justice, a demand for accountability that resonated with everyone watching. And as the cameras continued to roll, the world waited to see if James would finally acknowledge the truth, or if he would continue to hide behind his power. The confrontation between David and James became the talk of the city, dominating headlines and news cycles for days. Clips from the press conference were shared and dissected across social media, with most people praising David for his courage and integrity. The demand for a public apology had struck a chord. It was no longer just David's fight, but a rallying cry for justice. People wanted to see James held accountable, not just for David's sake, but for everyone who had been wronged by similar corporate practices. For James, the fallout was immediate and severe. His carefully constructed image was crumbling, and even those closest to him could see that he was struggling to keep up appearances. Investors began to pull back, and clients questioned their partnerships, fearing association with a company under such intense scrutiny. James's PR team scrambled to do damage control, but every statement they released only seemed to make things worse, as the public grew tired of vague promises and evasive language. The turning point came a week after the press conference, when an unexpected event shifted the narrative once again. A group of former employees, inspired by David's stand, came forward with their own stories. They shared accounts of how they had been abruptly laid off, how the lack of severance pay had devastated their families, and how they had struggled to rebuild their lives. Some of them had even brought documents and emails that exposed the harsh tactics James's company had used during the layoffs. It was clear that this wasn't just a case of necessary business decisions. It was a calculated effort to maximize profit at the expense of people's livelihoods. The evidence was damning, and it forced James into a corner. He could no longer claim ignorance or hide behind corporate jargon. The pressure mounted as calls for an apology grew louder, and soon, even those within his company began to distance themselves from him. Board members whispered about replacing him, and rumors of an internal revolt began to spread. Finally, after days of silence, James agreed to a televised address. The city held its breath, unsure of what to expect. When he appeared on screen, he looked different, tired, defeated, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. "I want to start by saying that I'm sorry," he began, his voice faltering slightly. "I'm sorry for the decisions I made, decisions that hurt a lot of people. When I laid off employees, I was thinking about numbers and profits, not about the lives those decisions would affect. That was wrong." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what came next. David Miller stood up and demanded accountability, not just for himself, but for everyone who was hurt by my actions. And he was right. I have been trying to avoid facing the truth, but I can't do that anymore. I owe you all an apology. I'm sorry to every person who was let go without consideration, to every family that struggled because of my choices. I know that words alone can't fix what happened, but I hope that this is a start. The apology was raw, far more vulnerable than anyone had expected. For the first time, James wasn't hiding behind his corporate mask. He was just a man acknowledging his mistakes. The response was mixed. Some people accepted his apology, believing it to be genuine, while others remained skeptical, unwilling to forgive so easily. But regardless of how it was received, one thing was clear. David had won a moral victory. He had forced James to confront his actions, something no amount of money or PR could have achieved. After the address, James announced a series of changes. He pledged to create a fund, not just for laid-off employees, but to support job training and career transition programs for those who had been affected. He also stepped down as CEO, acknowledging that the company needed new leadership to rebuild trust and move forward. The story didn't end there. David's actions had sparked a broader conversation about corporate accountability, and for weeks, other companies found themselves under scrutiny, forced to examine their own practices. It was as if a dam had broken, and people felt empowered to speak out, to demand better treatment in their workplaces. For David, the journey had been exhausting, but as he stood on the rooftop of a small building overlooking the city, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. He hadn't planned to become a symbol of resistance, but he had, and in doing so, he had found a part of himself he thought was lost forever. Emily joined him on the rooftop, a warm smile on her face. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You stood up to him, and you won." David shook his head, a soft smile on his lips. "I didn't do it alone. I just said what needed to be said. The people who stood with me, they're the real heroes." He looked out at the city, the sun setting in the distance, casting a warm, golden glow. "I spent so long thinking that I was invisible, that I didn't matter. But now I know that if you speak the truth, someone will listen." As the city lights began to flicker on, a gentle breeze swept through the air, carrying with it a sense of renewal. David didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. He had reclaimed his voice, and with it, his dignity. He turned to Emily, his eyes reflecting a newfound resolve. "There's still a lot of work to be done, but if I could survive that fire, I can survive anything." And as they left the rooftop, the city alive with the hum of possibility, it was clear that David's story had ignited something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It was a story of resilience, of the power of truth, and of the strength to stand up, even when the world tries to push you down. And in the end, it wasn't just about justice for David. It was about justice for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, unseen, and forgotten. David Miller's journey shows that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's courage can make a difference. By standing up for the truth, he forced a powerful man to confront his past and inspired others to demand justice. David's story is a reminder that no act of bravery goes unnoticed, and the fight for what's right is always worth it. If you were inspired by this story of resilience and redemption, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales like this one.